just think that right now, we were talking a little bit before we went live about how much of an impact this ruling has. To be clear, it's a stay, which means there's a pause until it comes back to the court if an application is granted on cert. But why don't you give the background for people watching right now, what temporary protected status is and why this ruling has such impact?
Yeah, so temporary protected status is basically a form of executive relief that allows the executive branch to grant the legal authorization for people to remain in the United States. So gives them lawful status, lawful presence, and then also authorizes them to work in the United States during the period of their temporary protected status. And temporary protected status is available when the executive branch makes a determination that your country of origin, the place to which you would otherwise be removed or deported, is basically in such a state or conditions as to make deportations or removal unwise. So the State Department obviously has issued travel advisories to United States citizens, telling them not to travel to Venezuela because of the risks of wrongful detention, torture while in detention, and so many other things. Not no enforcement of civil laws or criminal laws. So it was on that basis that Venezuelan migrants in the United States were granted temporary protected status, so that allowed them to be legally present in the United States and also to work legally in the United States while they had temporary protected status. And so early in the administration, Donald Trump canceled the temporary protected status for Venezuelan nationals, but a lower court had blocked that policy, thereby leaving in place that temporary protected status for Venezuelan nationals. And again, that protected them from possible deportation or removal and also allowed them to work legally in the United States. So
Mm.
that's the decision that the Supreme Court stayed or paused. And I think part of what made this particular shadow docket order so striking for me is this is a massive change in someone's life, rendering them having legal status, legal authorization, protections from deportation and removal to all of a sudden being vulnerable to deportation, all of a sudden no longer able to work legally in the United States. That's just a massive change. And you had no idea when you woke up this morning that that was going to happen.
Right. So there's going to be some time that this stay is going to be in effect before it comes back to the Supreme Court on the merits. So how long will these protections not be available for hundreds of thousands of people?
I mean, we don't know. It really depends on how quickly the proceedings happen in the lower courts. Sometimes these cases can take years to come back to the United States Supreme Court. So you're right to say this could be quite a long time for these individuals to be vulnerable to deportation and removal and not being able to work legally in the United States while that litigation remains ongoing. And I should say, for some of the individuals who had temporary protected status, it's possible that they might have some other form of legal status or some other form of legal authorization. Maybe they had an asylum claim or an asylum application that would entitle them to remain in the United States. But my sense is, of the almost 350,000 people who just had their temporary protected status stripped from them, the number of people who have some other form of legal status or legal authorization is not that large.
Mm. And one of the things that you noticed right away, and I noticed right away, there was one noted dissent from Justice Jackson, no other noted dissent in the court. Now, that doesn't mean that no other justice expressed reservations. The order doesn't actually say what each of the justices was thinking. But what do you think is going on there? Why only Justice Jackson coming forward and saying she would have denied this stay?
I can only speculate, but one thought that definitely came to my head is, was there possible horse trading between this case and the major due process ruling that we received on Friday afternoon that, of course, blocked the Trump administration from carrying out these extraordinary renditions of some Venezuelan nationals to the El Salvador mega prison. So I think part of what made this order today in the TPS case additionally concerning for me is it's not just that Venezuelan nationals, Venezuelan migrants are vulnerable to deportation and removal. It's that the Trump administration, because of the Alien Enemies Act proclamation, has designated them as potentially vulnerable to these extraordinary renditions to the El Salvador Terrorism Confinement Center.
Mm,
So, I think I wondered whether there was any kind of, if not explicit agreement, understanding or suggestion that if the court basically told the Trump administration, you cannot effectuate these extraordinary renditions, sending people to El Salvador potentially irrevocably to this, again, prison with horrific conditions and forcing individuals into forced labor, could you maybe authorize the Trump administration to withdraw temporary protected status and having that be some sort of exchange or understanding between the justices? Because it is a little difficult for me to imagine that both Justices Kagan and Sotomayor were fully on board with
mm,
pausing the lower court decision in this case. It's possible they negotiated for the additional language in the TPS order, which says, of course, individual Venezuelan migrants could challenge, again, individually their potential removal or potential withdrawal of their work authorization. But again, the number of individuals who are going to be able to do so successfully is quite small. So I'm still left wondering, was there any kind of horse trading? Again, even if
right.
not explicitly, maybe, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Right. And it comes in such rapid order from that 7-2 route on the Alien Enemies Act.
Yep.
And so that would go to your point of, is there horse trading going on here? You had all of the Trump appointees in that decision joining the 7-2 decision, which was a thorough rebuke of this end run of due process, which caused the all caps posts on Truth Social that we all witnessed. So, what's next?
Do
I'm
you
look.
think the court is going to get some favorable truthing in light of this one, or is this just a one-way ratchet?
I can't imagine that any praise would be in all caps if it were to
Fair,
arrive.
fair.
But we'll see what happens. These truths, as they are ironically known, sometimes have a way of coming around. So it goes back down. I'm looking at the order right
Yeah.
now. That it stayed pending the disposition of the appeal in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit
Yeah.
and disposition of a petition for a writ of certiorari. So this is going to take some time to go through the entire process. There's the
Yes.
Intermediate Court of Appeals.
Yep.
If they deny cert, the stay will terminate automatically. If it's granted, it will terminate upon sending down the judgment of this court. Um, so what do you think in terms? So we discussed the horse trading potentially going on here. We discussed the proximity of these two rulings, both involving Venezuelan immigrants.
Yep.
Uh, what is the court saying with these two orders in rapid succession?
Deport people better. I mean, if you think back to the first Trump administration and even some earlier cases, it felt like the Republican justices were telling the Trump administration, or at least the Chief Justice was signaling to the Trump administration, dot your I's and cross your T's. Think back to his rescission of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or his attempt to add a citizenship question to the census. Those were cases where the Chief Justice told the Trump administration, you could do this, but you need to follow legal procedures and process in order to do so. So I take these cases together to be in that spirit, telling the Trump administration, look, you can carry out your cruel, horrific mass deportation program, but you still have to conduct these deportations in a way that complies with basic legal process, which again is putting an individual before an immigration judge, allowing them the possibility of appealing up to the Board of Immigration Appeals, potentially allowing them to challenge their removal or deportation in a court. And it's that kind of process and due process that the Trump administration has been extremely averse to, hostile to, sometimes challenging whether non-citizens have due process rights at all. Spoiler, they do. But that's how I took these cases is
Right.
you can do this, but you have to do it in a particular way.
Right. And speaking of deporting better, there's this astonishing photo that we actually ran in All Rise News with the last order on the Alien Enemies Act. It was published by Getty, and it was an overhead image
The
of
SOS.
the SOS, and these
Yep.
were presumably Venezuelan immigrants in the yard of a Texas ICE
Yep.
facility.
Yep.
They spelled with their bodies SOS and held a sign. And it took me a little bit of time. Getty got the translation wrong, and I was reading the
Yeah.
Spanish. There was no punctuation, but astonishing message. It said, "Help! We want to be deported to Venezuela.
Yes.
uh, we aren't terrorists." Now that line, they are not saying do not deport us. They are not saying what they are saying is we aren't terrorists. We are not from El Salvador. Presumably that's the unspoken part of the sign. Do not send us to a strongman's dungeon in a country that we don't know. And so often the commentary surrounding all of this has to do with, oh, the court won't let the Trump administration do anything, and that's not what's happening at all. The immigrants in this facility were staging this astonishing and powerful protest to be sent to a country where they wouldn't be tortured in a dungeon for without well, I mean, at least not in Bukele's prison. So in talking about uh, that particular case, what I wanted to pivot a little bit to your book, which I have behind me,
Well, so
and
can I just say two
yeah,
things
absolutely.
about the many cases involving the Venezuelan migrants. I mean, part of what was so horrifying to me in reading so much of the excellent journalism that has been done about the cases of the Venezuelan migrants sent to the El Salvador prison is you read the stories and these men signed notices. They talked to their families. They accepted that they could be deported and that they should be removed, but they thought they were going to Venezuela. And
Right,
the gut punch of their families not knowing where they are, realizing they're not in Venezuela, seeing their faces on television, some cases being forcibly shaved, crying, it just made that story grotesque. And
right,
second, I wanted to draw attention to the Cato Institute actually released a report today in which they attempted to review the cases of the more than 200 men who had been subject to these extraordinary renditions to Venezuela. And in their analysis, they concluded that almost 50 of them entered the United States potentially lawfully, did not violate any immigration laws. And that's part of what makes these hurried, frantic, processless potential expulsions and removals so horrifying.
right, right. And I want to make clear with that photograph that we were talking about earlier, those men were covered by the Supreme Court's order. They were part
Yes.
of the class from the Northern District of Texas. That ICE facility is in the Northern District of Texas. So when we covered it, we said that SCOTUS answered these immigrants SOS because that's
Yep.
exactly what happened. At least for now, before the case comes back there, they cannot be sent to El Salvador under this wartime power used three times in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Um, I want to, in pivoting to your book,
Sorry.
get to the kind of no, that's okay. No, I'm glad that it was a very important conversation. I wanted to talk about your thoughts because we talked about this earlier in an article last week. Um, how what it seems that the court is doing big picture in terms of handling the Trump docket. There seems to be an evening of the ledger happening a little bit today. That you use the term horse trading. Um, what is this court's response to attacks on the institution by Trump that we're seeing on his social media platform, and that we're seeing through his actions. You've detected a pattern.
Yeah, so my sense is if you zoom out even bigger and you're not just focusing on the Trump cases, you would see the pattern we were talking about earlier, where they're kind of saying deport people better. That is, the Republican justices on board in important respects with a lot of what the Trump administration is doing. It's just they don't want to be forced to say, this version of it is legal. So if you think about, for example, Donald Trump's executive order that declared the entire swath of disparate impact liability of civil rights law, unconstitutional. Disparate impact liability is the portion of civil rights laws that prohibit policies that have a disproportionately negative effect on racial minorities. Donald Trump said that violates equal protection of the laws. There's a case up at the Supreme Court where they are deciding a similar question about the Voting Rights Act and whether the Voting Rights Act prohibitions on disparate impact, or at least some versions of them, are unconstitutional. And it seems like the justices are trying to avoid a head on collision or confrontation with the Trump administration, where they would be forced to say the administration is in violation of their orders. And so they have, I think, made it harder to challenge, some of what the Trump administration is doing, including in cases involving the Department of Education, the freezing of funds, including in the Alien Enemies Act litigation, including in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, narrowing the powers of the lower court to correct that wrongful expulsion. So I think, as we were saying, the Republican justices want some plausible deniability. They want some kind of cover for the administration doing what they are doing, but doing it better, or more, superficially legal. But that's kind of how I understand a lot of what they're doing. And again, for those people who think the court is at odds with the Trump administration or standing up to the Trump administration, I'd say think also about the cases about the inclusion of LGBT reading materials in schools or religious public schools, and ask yourself, how far apart is the court really from the Trump administration?
And maybe erasing the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution entirely is a bridge too far, as
Right.
was the case in
But
a
making it
nine.
unenforceable,
Now,
maybe there,
exactly,
right now we're talking.
exactly. Right, right, and that shows that that was an interesting split in that 7-2 decision. That the majority made a point to say that the proposition that some notice is necessary, that's 9-0. But you have Thomas and you have Alito going forward and saying, well, but we have no jurisdiction to enforce it. So that goes exactly to your point. There's that technicality and that escape hatch.
I struggle to think of things the Trump administration could do that Thomas and Alito wouldn't sign off on. I recognize they joined the Kilmar Abrego Garcia order. My guess
Right,
is that the language encouraging the courts to defer to the executive branch's power over immigration and the suggestion that the lower court had gone too far were their conditions for joining that order.
right.
But I just think it speaks volumes that you can always assume there are two votes for whatever the Trump administration
Mm,
does. And if the court says, 7-2, Donald Trump cannot just summarily round people up and ship them off to wherever, I don't think that suggests any kind of moderation at the court. I was at the dentist earlier today, and even my dentist was like, Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito,
mhm.
those guys are always going to let the Trump administration do everything. So
Right,
even
right.
dentists know.
Once January 6th iconography and flags are hanging outside of the house, and all of the donations from the right-wing donors come to the fore due to ProPublica's Doty reporters and tenacious journalism. We get a peek under the hood of what's going on, even if it weren't completely clear from the courts. Thank you, Professor Litman, for everything. We're going to be publishing this interview in full on All Rise News. If you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll get it right in our inbox, and I hope to have you on so much more often to help us be fully informed of what's going on in the Supreme
Always happy to do so, and thanks for displaying my book. The Alito flag debacle is in the introduction. The full title of the book is Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes.
Court. Thank you so much, and looking forward to having you on again.
Sounds great.
Bye bye.